Hi everybody, welcome to our latest talk here on trauma, different cultures, and how as different church communities we can respond to this incredible need that's all around us. And so for the last few talks here, we're going to be talking about various things that we can do to actually minister to the people around us. And you know what, honestly, it kind of felt like this next topic was one that we really needed to start with for me, for thinking about how do we respond. So we might have a bit of a intellectual or academic understanding of what trauma is and maybe some of the issues that people in our communities have around us. But how do we respond? How do we actually go about doing this? And you know, it might seem like a strange place maybe to begin, but I think the most biblical way to begin and the way that makes the most sense even from a clinical point of view is through the process of lament. Now, this isn't an easy topic to talk about. In fact, it's the one that I labored the most over, interestingly enough, when I was preparing these different talks. It's a difficult thing to think about, it's a difficult thing to talk about, and I think that it requires from us a commitment to go places that are really difficult. And I think it also might require from us an action, a reaction maybe, to the things that come up when we're lamenting. And I'll talk about that towards the end of this talk. But to start, I have a quote here from Anne Voskamp. She writes, "Lament is a cry of belief in a good God, a God who has his ear to our hearts, a God who transfigures the ugly into beauty. Complaint is the bitter howl of unbelief in any benevolent God in this moment, a distrust in the love beat of the Father's heart." So this idea of lament, it's a cry of belief. It's saying, God, you are who you are. You are loving. You are powerful. You are holy. And yet these hateful, unholy, evil things are happening in this world and have happened to me. Lord, how do we reconcile this? Again, like I said, it's not an easy talk for us. It's not an easy thing for me to share about, even though I deal with trauma and pain and heartache every day in my job and in my professional life and, frankly, in my ministry. Yet I still find that this talk was the hardest to prepare for. You know, maybe that's because this idea of lament really rubs against what we in the West, like how we tend to understand our churches, right? How we understand our faith, how we understand God. We want to think about God being triumphant, victorious, full of joy, strong, right? We have the victory in him. We're going to win. All these kinds of different ideas and thoughts that we have about God and our place in church and our place in him and his victory. And you know, all of that's biblical and it's all true. And it's a wonderful hope, so I don't mean to downplay that one bit. But you know, at the same time, the Bible is also full of all kinds of different examples of lament. So many when you actually stop and think about it. There's even a book called Lamentations, right? Even one of our prophets that we quote all the time in church was known as the weeping prophet, Jeremiah. The weeping prophet. Think about that for a second. He was known. It didn't just happen one time. He was known as the weeping prophet. And something that's stayed with me since the time I became a Christian when I was a teenager is this idea of Jesus being called a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Jesus, the Son of God, given that kind of identity. And so when we're interacting with someone who's suffering, a lot of times with good intentions, I think because of the way that maybe we've constructed our faith and the way that we understand the world, and maybe our discomfort with suffering as a whole. We just want to end the suffering, right? We just want to do the thing to help them to feel better. We want to solve the problem. And I'm like that. When a client brings a problem to me, or when a loved one brings a problem to me for that matter, I want to solve it right away and fix it, right? Of course. And it's well-intentioned, and it's a loving kind of it comes from a loving part of my heart. We want to jump right to the solution, and we want to help, we want to fix it. But the interesting thing about this is that this isn't always helpful or possible. when we think about the kind of populations that we're kind of talking about in this series, we're talking about people who fled horrific wars, maybe natural disasters. Maybe many of their people were killed in a genocide. They've experienced all kinds of violations, all kinds of horrible things. Things that there's not an easy answer to. Maybe even just the idea of struggling to integrate into a new country and trying to deal with a new culture. Or maybe even the health issues that they experience as a result of all the stress that they've been under. Well, there isn't an easy answer or explanation for any of these things. There isn't a magic kind of an answer that I can give a client, or like a magic pill that I can just prescribe somehow to help them to feel better. It's really like an impossible situation. There isn't an answer to it, if I'm honest. And probably a lot of us actually face things like that in our lives. Even when you think about the pandemic right now, right? There's all kinds of loss. There's all kinds of pain and suffering and trauma actually involved with that there isn't an easy answer to. We want to fix the problem though, and I feel that in my work, but what has actually been more helpful to my clients is to create a space for people to honestly and truthfully lament and mourn and grieve. A place where they can cry, express those feelings, and even literally cry out to God. It's very interesting how working as a trauma therapist who works with people from all different faith backgrounds, right? Or even lack thereof in terms of their faith and how they identify. But it's amazing how that therapy space in a time of lament becomes transformed into a place of like holy prayer. And I'm not just saying that, like it's the truth. There's all kinds of folks who would never call themselves a Christian who find themselves praying to Jesus, lamenting to Jesus in that moment. I find that very interesting. So what's been more helpful is to create a space for people to lament. If you're familiar at all with the situation of what happened to the Yazidi people in northern Iraq, basically they were ISIS, who many of us are familiar with, tried to eradicate them. And as part of that, they took all of the women and they used them as sex slaves. And some of these women have escaped, and now I'm working with one of these women. Right? They live in our communities here in Canada, our nice suburban communities, right? Women who have faced the kinds of injustices and violations that you would never ever dream of. Things that you maybe think you would read in a historical book from like the Holocaust or something like that. It's happened to them. And right now, you're at the grocery store and they're right beside you in the aisle. And working with me. And so, right now our work has really just been about lamenting. I wish I had an easy answer for her. I wish that I could give her some kind of magic pill and heal her and help her to forget this stuff and help her to move on in her life. But instead, what we're doing is we're just having her feel those feelings, acknowledge them, cry out, talk about the injustices, talk about the pain, talk about the things that she has lost, aspects of her identity, her family, her way of life, her sense of the world being a safe, good place. And you might think, wow, that's awfully depressing. But the idea is that the pathway that we notice in trauma therapy is that in order to heal, we have to help our clients to feel the feelings, and it's feelings of lament. Right? Instead of just trying to cover over those feelings and say, no, we're going to try to solve this. If you try to do that, you can kind of cover over it for a little while, but the feelings are actually still there underneath. So instead, what we do is we try to help people to tolerate those feelings and experience them. And by doing that, it actually releases some of that pent-up energy in our bodies and moves the person on to not doing that reaction kind of stance in their body, or that reaction kind of survival mode. It helps them to release some of that so that they can be present, more fully present in today's society. Didn't explain that very well, but the idea is that feelings of lament actually is the pathway to healing. That is actually the solution. Now the thing about it is that it takes time. And it's not easy, it's not comfortable. And it takes commitment, right? Like to actually walk with someone through feelings of lament. You have to be emotionally invested. You have to be ready to do that work with someone, ready to go there with someone, which is a huge call, a huge ask. But in the end, it leads to healing. And I've seen it in my work over and over again. I've been a trauma therapist now for over 15 years, straight every day, working with people on their horrific traumas that they've experienced. And many tears have been shed in my presence. And even my eyes will get teary with clients because I open up myself to go there with them. Now, of course, we have to put boundaries around ourselves. We have to make sure that we're emotionally ready to do that and that we're safe to do that too, right? You just don't walk into doing that kind of work without preparing yourself. But again, that solution of healing is to lament with people. That's where it begins. So this is the attitude, this is the stance that we need to take if we want to help people to heal. We have to be willing at least to do this. We have to be a church community that's open to mourn with people about this kind of stuff. And not just forget about it, not just try to brush it, put it under the carpet or brush it off or whatever, but to acknowledge it and to give that space, that safe space for people to experience their feelings and to call out to God in an honest way. Say, God, this has happened to me. Now what? And in those moments, he comes in and he heals. And it's a beautiful thing. Now, at the same time, when the church approaches lament, it forces us also to look inside. And I think it forces us to examine whether or not we're complicit in any of the kinds of traumas of people who've experienced traumas in our communities. So this might be controversial. This might not be really what you thought you signed up for. But just bear with me for a second. As a church, have we lamented on the history that some churches or that some Christians have had in perpetuating racism, or the negative impact of the ways that we've interacted with our Indigenous people here in Canada, or maybe sexism against women, right? Even the way that LGBT communities have been treated in Canada, historically speaking. Not easy stuff, right? And if we're really honest, maybe we ourselves weren't part of that. Maybe we were a part of it, and we still need to lament that. But even if we weren't, even if we were truly innocent, like us as individuals or us in our local congregations, as a Christian sort of society, right? There are still so many people who identify Christians as the dangerous ones because their community has experienced oppression of some kind in the name of Christ. So, not to say that we have to take the blame for these things, but I think that an appropriate stance we can take in lament is to acknowledge these things, and if we have made mistakes and if we have committed sins, to confess them and to repent. And I think this is something that, again, with the way that our churches understand God's victory and all that kind of stuff, it's not something that we really automatically go to. But I get the sense it would be really helpful for people to understand that their local body and their local community is one that's willing and fearless enough to look at themselves and say, yeah, we take all this stuff seriously, and you know what? God has spoken to us, and we're changing the way that we do things. And we acknowledge the past. So I have a couple of quotes from Emmanuel Cantongole and Chris Rice about this very piece. Christians are guilty of intensifying brokenness in many places. We have so often reproduced society rather than offering a witness to it. Learning lament involves not only seeing the church as broken, but also seeing our complicity. And there's nothing romantic about reconciliation. We do not see the depth of our captivity. We prefer reconciliation without repentance. So finally, can the church shift its approach towards being able to tolerate and ultimately embrace this stance of lament? Can we go there with people? Are we ready to go there with people? What will it take for us to get ourselves ready? Perhaps this is one kind of unanticipated blessing of COVID. Maybe it brings us all a little bit closer to that idea of being in a state of lament, of calling out to God in our desperation and our vulnerability, where we can relate to other people who are doing the same thing right beside us in our communities. And again, maybe this idea of calling out to God in complete humility will also cause us to continue to search our hearts to ensure that we're doing all that we can to not perpetuate the kind of stuff that Emmanuel and Chris talked about in that quote. This is the posture that will lead to healing, both in our churches as well as for the individuals that we want to reach out to. So let's consider lament, and let's embrace it, even though it's difficult, even though it's hard, and even though it kind of rubs against our church culture the wrong way. But I think if we look closely enough in the Bible, it's actually the right way. God bless you.